Welcome to today's show. My name is Michael Juberg, and I'm with the Global Compassion Coalition, an online community with the mission to build a world based on compassion. Today, we have the privilege of speaking with Dr. Simon Cottle, a professor emeritus of media and communication at Cardiff University in Wales. He has authored 14 books and over 150 articles related to media, conflicts, and global crises. Dr. Cottle is expected to release his latest book, Communicating a World in Crisis. Thank you so much for joining us today, Simon.
Thank you, Michael. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm looking forward to talking with you. Thank you.
Yeah, I really appreciate you giving us some of your time. So, I always like to start off asking people about their personal journey into this work. What led you to the work that you dedicated your life to?
Okay, well, I guess to be honest, that in the last 10 years, my work has taken a turn really to a much more expanded understanding of how at least I approach crises within the contemporary world. I think we're living in a planetary time when the globe itself is interconnected and that our life chances and indeed the chance of life itself moving into the future is now in peril, I think. So it's that basic backdrop that has given me a sense of urgency to try and shift the boundaries within my own academic field and indeed more widely to try and encourage people, I think, to think of the profound ways in which human existence is now impacting the globe and not simply to focus on what can be quite a terrifying prospect, but also to think about how we might intervene within this world with compassion, with productive ideas, fertile ideas about how existence could be different and it could be synchronous and in harmony with the web of life. So that, in a nutshell, I think is really where my research is at the moment. I've always been interested in conflict in media, for the most part, different conflicts, whether it's based around material inequalities and injustices, or whether it's based around identity politics, is in fact played out in and through media. And therefore, the media becomes a crucial terrain that we need to explore and investigate very carefully, I think, to understand how the dynamics of conflict are being played out in the contemporary world. We live in a mediated age, I think that most people can agree with that, where politics, where conflict, where identities are both sustained and reproduced, but also challenged in and through media. So I'm interested in unpacking what happens within that media sphere, not simply because I'm interested in media, but because I'm interested in the wider world and how societies change and indeed how they could be improved in the future.
Well, that's a wonderful introduction to your work. And I'm curious myself, what do you think is the role of the news media in this current era?
Well, in the current era, which I describe as a world in crisis, other people might talk about the planetary emergency or the global polycrisis. Other people talk about civilizational collapse or the age of catastrophes or the age of resilience. I think in this current unprecedented conjuncture within human society and human history. The role of the media is for sure, certainly, to tell people in no uncertain terms about the dynamics and the trajectories that are converging in the contemporary period that now threaten human existence and indeed, as I said earlier, the existence of life as we know it on planet Earth. And so that's the first thing, that there really has to be a realistic appraisal and evaluation of what's happening. And then thereafter, we need to expect, and indeed there should be an obligation on all news media to talk about and to scrutinize the various politics and the various policy agendas that need to be articulated and enacted, which are trying to address the multiple ways, the multiple and different ways in which the global crises are now unraveling in the contemporary world. And when we open up that box, we find an awful lot of complexity, a lot of pessimism, but there is also some hope, I think. And there are also some seeds of contemporary practice that can hopefully be encouraged to flourish in the future. So it's not all a bleak story, I don't think, a bleak narrative within the world of journalism, But there is certainly an awful lot that needs to change, and there's an awful lot that needs to be done much better in the months and the years and the decades moving forward.
So you often refer in your work and even here so far as the world being in a state of crisis, the world in crisis.
Yeah.
Is that hyperbolic, or do we actually think that we're kind of hitting an inflection point, that the world is at a tipping point, whether it's politically, whether it's global climate? Are we really at a point now that it demands that type of language to kind of underscore how serious these issues are?
I think most certainly it does. It's certainly not hyperbolic. In the world of journalism, of course, we're used to sensationalizing headlines. Hyperbolism is very often associated with journalistic discourse and language, particularly in populist or tabloid news media. And I think, in a way, actually, this has been part of a problem within the field of media and communications, particularly if we approach communications as a matter of language and discourse only. We are inclined, I think, to think of crisis as a discursive construction, a social construction that may well be exaggerated or in some ways unrepresentative of the nature of reality as it actually is. I say this as a problem because, yes, I do think, as indeed do many others, people working in different disciplines and in the sciences particularly, think that we are at an unprecedented moment in human history. We live in a truly globalized planet, notwithstanding the political differences and the multiple communities and identities that comprises humanity on planet Earth. We nevertheless do all share one thing. We share the same planet. We more or less share the same oceans and the same air, and we have more or less share access to everything that we need to sustain life. I say most of us because an awful lot of us increasingly don't. Water shortages, food insecurity, energy insecurity, increasing exposure to conflict, global inequality and poverty, zoonotic diseases, nuclear weaponry, and indeed other weapons. The sixth mass extinction, which is the unprecedented dying out of species at unprecedented rates, the loss of biodiversity, the growth of monocultural agriculture, which is leading to the poisons of pesticides and fertilizers, the erosion of topsoil, which gives us life. It's that which we need in order to grow crops and so on. This long list, I'm sorry, I apologize for the long list of depressing realities, but these types of trajectories are now arriving at a point within human society that is unsustainable. For example, the Stockholm Resilience Centre has identified 7 of the 9 planetary boundaries that we need to sustain life as now being encroached upon and exceeded. That the planet is trying to sustain more than it can do in terms of its ecological capacities. And this is the problem that we are confronting. And it's a problem, I would argue, and many would agree, I suspect, that ultimately comes from an economic system that is unsustainable but constantly rapacious in its pursuit of growth. The world cannot simply grow and grow and grow and grow in terms of its material exploitation of the world's resources. We've exceeded what the globe can offer us. And it's that is now contributing to the pollution of our rivers and seas, the terrible plastic problems that are toxins that are encroaching upon environments. It's the deforestation that is being made, the forests being cut down in order to grow crops for cattle because we're increasingly meat eaters in the world, and so on and so forth. That these types of processes really cannot be sustained. So it may sound hyperbolic, but when we look at the science and we look at the underpinning knowledge base that is now offered to us within the earth sciences and across other scientific domains, we really do need to recognize what is happening. Now, of course, I shouldn't need to say this, should I, in a way that climate change is now hitting us and it's starting to hit many people hard, and it's only set to get worse, so increasing storms more frequently and with greater severity. And we're all starting to experience this now. It's not simply a problem over there in the south, that domain of the world that was once seen to be the recipient of humanitarian aid from a benevolent West. And that's an idealized and romanticized way of putting it. But we ourselves in this privileged West now are also likely to be experiencing humanitarian disasters and in need of humanitarian support, whether it's Hurricane Katrina in the United States, the forest fires in California, whether it's the increasing floods and mudslides in Europe and in China, the terrible fires that have afflicted Australia in recent years. These events are historically unprecedented, and they're part of climate change. But climate change itself, and this is my point, this is why I'm using this term, a world in crisis, that these different types, seemingly different types of global crises, are in fact part of a planetary system now that can't sustain itself, and that it's giving expression to these diverse crises that are interlinking and that are unpredictable in a way because they're complex. These are complex crises. They can't be simply understood. And my task as a media and communication specialist is to try and understand what is the role of the media and communications in trying to get a better handle, get some leverage on what is happening in order to hopefully wake people up to what is happening so that they can then engage in processes of amelioration, of redress, and so on and so forth. The very vitalistic arena of politics really needs to become much more alert to and sensitized to these issues. Not simply for us, not simply for the other species that we have the good fortune to share this planet with, but for future generations and for the web of life in its entirety in the future. And if there is to be a future. So this is what drives me in my last few years, I suppose, of trying to engage with media and communications from a serious and humanistic viewpoint.
That's quite an imperative that animates your work, and I'm very impressed with the scope of what journalism itself can address. I think you're talking about all the planetary issues that are interconnected, and it seems like journalism is a very sensible tool to address it at once, and communicate what the problem is, needs for the need to address it. It sounds like you've really done so much work, and it seems like it's culminating in one of your latest books, Communicating in a World of Crisis. What is contained within that book?
Okay, well, thank you. Yes, it's an edited book, so obviously it involves a range of other academics. And what I really wanted to do was to try and kickstart, I think, a little bit the necessity for academics to engage with holistically, that's within an integrated and with an overview sense of a world in crisis, not just climate change, not just biodiversity loss, not just heat waves and so on, or whatever it might be, but to really understand and engage with the planetary nature of the threats that are now confronting humanity and other species. And I wanted people to, if you like, share their best practices, their best ideas in terms of what their particular discipline or field is already doing to try and wake people up to the contemporary reality, but also in terms of how different audiences can be engaged in and encouraged to participate in processes of knowing, but also processes of doing, of action. How we engage with others in collective endeavors to try and address or ameliorate or mitigate the sorts of processes and problems that we have to confront. So this book, called a Communicating a World in Crisis, includes discussion of journalism. It includes discussion of indigenous cultures and how they engage in journalism. It includes discussion of theatre, of eco-art, of eco-literature. It includes chapters on museums. It includes chapters on education and pedagogy, so journalism training, but also sustainability science and how that's taught in schools and colleges. It includes discussion of artificial intelligence and the deficiencies and way in which that debate is currently being played out. And it also includes a discussion of what is increasingly being termed by the followers of Malcolm Parlett, his ideas of whole intelligence, the different dimensions to intelligence that can be intelligently deployed in a world in crisis and a world that's waking up. So, as I say, this book is deliberately quite eclectic. It ranges across very different communication fields as a way of sharing the best practice and some of the good practices, as well as the problems and deficiencies that remain within these different communicative fields. The goal has to be, I think, to sharing good ideas so that we can all start to engage in a much more rounded way. And I think, quite often we work in silos, we work in rather discrete areas, and academia, just like journalism, does that. It's safer to work on a little piece of the jigsaw than it is to try and discuss in holistic terms the jigsaw as a whole. There are reasons for that. All our academics are emotionally involved, I think, in what could be termed, the imposter syndrome. We all feel slightly inadequate to talk about these bigger world problems because none of us simply knows enough. These are complex problems. However, some of us do have to start to engage with a bigger problem. And maybe it's easier for somebody like me at my time of my academic career to put my head above the parapet and start talking about things that I don't really have that much expertise in, but nevertheless, we have to start trying to pull together different ideas to talk about the common problems that confront us all. The time of living in our little academic silo is gone, whether we like it or not. We will be enforced, if you like, to engage with a much more holistic and enlightened understanding of the global nature of our planet today, I think. So, in my own little way, small way, this book and my expert colleagues who are experts in their different fields have offered some of their best thinking and best ideas. And I want to see that quite widely read. Obviously, we write to be read. And I would like to see that encouraging other people in the world of academia and more generally to engage in thinking outside the box.
Wonderful. Well, I appreciate you breaking that down. It sounds like a very interesting book, and I wish you well on that.
Thank you.
I love this is very interesting. I haven't really talked to too many academics in journalism, and when I think about kind of the challenges of most academics, it's visibility, right? We are often not great communicators. We're polished in our field, but it's not necessarily our thrust to get in front of people, speak to the masses about it. Obviously, we want all science to be, or academia in general, to be public interfacing, right? We want people to have awareness of our work. How does academics in journalism work? I mean, does it naturally have a public facing appeal, or is it still kind of confined by the same challenges of academia that people might publish and it might just go to a very small corner of the world? Or does your innate footing in journalism have a broader reach? How does that work?
Yeah, I mean, it would be wonderful if the academics working in the field of journalism studies, that has been quite well established now over the last 20, 30 years or so, it would be great if everything that they wrote was suddenly taken up by the news media and our colleagues in journalism. Sometimes it is, but more often than not, unsurprisingly, it's not. That the news media has its own news agenda. It operates to its own professional codes and orientations. And although many of us would like to try and influence the world of journalism and do our best to do that, journalism has its own relative autonomy, I think, and it's quite precious about how it sees the world and how it will report upon the world. So, in that sense, I think academics working in the field of communications and journalism studies, particularly, aren't necessarily any more advantaged than any other discipline in terms of getting their message across in and through the news media. I mean, maybe I could say a few words about the news media and why I think it's relevant. I think in the world of global crises and the conflicts that I outlined in a little bit of detail earlier on, I think it's quite often the case that people who are waking up to the plight of the world and people working in relation to the ideas of, the Global Compassion Coalition, I would include there. I imagine many of the people that you know are precisely aware of some of the dire threats that are occurring in the world. And I think very often that we share, those people who are awakening, if you like, to what is happening. I think we share a general malaise about the news media. We tend to see that the news media is not engaging sufficiently with climate change, with environmental despoilation, and all the rest. That the news media follows its own agenda based on news values of typically conflict, deviance, violence, visual imagery, sensationalism, something that's negative rather than something that's positive, and so on. The more of those that you can find in a news story, the more newsworthy that news story will be from a journalistic point of view. And somehow we have to try and inveigle a deeper engagement with the nature of the problems that the world is confronting, I think, into the news media. Now, the explanations for why the news media do what they do is interesting and important. And we know, so if I just run through them very quickly, political economy, that most news media are corporate enterprises. They're seeking profit, they're seeking ratings, they're seeking revenue. So they're looking for large audiences for the most part. This shapes and delimits public discourse. They rely on elite sources to guarantee an everyday source of news. So the primary definers of major issues are very often leading politicians or indeed leading business leaders and others with established positions of status and authority within society. That often means there's a democratic deficit in terms of the ordinary voices that can find their way into the news media and possibly challenge dominant agendas. That's very difficult to do. Talk to people from Extinction Rebellion or some of the other movements, social movements for change, and they will tell you very eloquently and expertly, I'm sure, that they struggle to find a good press within the mainstream news media. So political economy, social hierarchy, maybe something of the elite backgrounds of some journalists, certainly the need to conform to news media outlets and their own particular way of understanding the world will shape and delimit news agendas. And there are particular reasons that I think journalism might run shy of engaging with a holistic and interdependent understanding of the crises that it's reporting on. That's the downside to journalism. But I think where there is an upside, or at least there's a potential upside, and this is based on what journalism already does in small measure, but it could be expanded, and that is that journalism can seek out the humanistic story. It can engage with societal values. It can have a moral horizon inscribed within its reporting. It can engage in reporting through a prism of understanding that does seek out that human interest. So ideas of compassion and emotion and effect are very much part and parcel of what telling a good journalistic story is all about. These types of journalistic tools and narratives could, I think, be harnessed to exploring and engaging audiences about the problems and the travails of the contemporary world. And they are put to good use in some examples. So if you think of how journalism behaves, say, for example, in Britain in the Second World War, Britain was engaged in a total war situation. Journalism is on side with its populace. It's encouraging the population to engage in all sorts of activities, growing crops for ordinary consumption by ordinary people, for example, engaging in collective efforts that are selfless and altruistic. Journalism does have a historical record of when the chips are down, of being able to engage in practices that are for the collective good. And now it's those types of performative ways in which journalism can behave, I think, that need to be encouraged and deepened in the future. They need to be honed and shaped in relation to the development of a regenerative culture that is sustainable in the future and not simply in the present. And journalism, I think, has a large part to play in that. It will only play that role when civil society becomes mobilized enough, I think, to encourage that practice and to put pressure on politicians, democratic politicians, to engage with the reality that we're all now confronting. that's a big story. That's a big, is that possible? Well, who knows? But we have to try. I think there's no option but to try. And some people are already doing that, of course, in social movements for change. And indeed, some academics working in their particular fields are also, I think, trying to push their agenda to make sure that a happier outcome can occur in the future rather than a pessimistic foregone conclusion.
And so maybe you mentioned a little bit about the Global Compassion Coalition, which is obviously how we connect. How did
Yeah.
you get involved with the GCC? What was your personal connection to that?
I think I encountered it through. How did it happen? I think I was. There are a number, interestingly, within the world of social media and the internet. There's a number of independent NGOs and interest groups, and I was involved with the Deep Transformation Network. Jeremy Lent, a marvelous man who's written a brilliant book on the web of life and the web of meaning. His network, I think, invited somebody from the Global Compassion Coalition to come along, and I looked you up, and I thought, well, this is part of this broader church of civil society entities, I think, who are all pushing in the same direction, I think. And there are a number of entities. And I think that's how it's going to have to be, isn't it? There's going to be no one big social movement. There's going to be a coalition of diverse and disparate viewpoints, but we need to share a basic fundamental orientation to what a good and a fair and an equitable society would be within a sustainable planet. And I think to focus in on issues of compassion is both necessary, but also extremely significant, I think, in terms of how we think about communications and how we engage with each other. Extinction Rebellion, I mentioned earlier on, I'm very struck by their deep-seated humanity as well as realist understanding of the extent and the depth of the problems that they're confronting. So they'll sign off their communications, for example, with love and rage. They have a non-judgmental and a deep disposition to try and understand the other before they simply engage in a judgmental response to people who may not yet be where they are in terms of their level of understanding and where the movement is in terms of what it's trying to achieve. So I have an awful amount of respect for people who I think are thinking compassionately. But as I say, this needs to be tailored and honed in and through communications. This is where politics is played out. It's where projects of change are discussed and deliberated. And it's where we have to engage with people who are very often of different backgrounds, different faiths, different ideologies, who hold different discourses to us. But we have to find the common ground, and compassion is absolutely essential, I think, within that project for change.
This has been wonderful talking with you, Dr. Cottle. I really appreciate you sharing so much of your work about your book, Communicating in a World of Crisis, a World in Crisis, rather. And it's been so enlightening. And we look forward to hearing how this book goes. So thank you so much for joining us. And we hope you have a wonderful holiday and enjoy your new year.
Thank you, Michael, and good luck with everything that you do and your marvelous organization. So I look forward to seeing how that develops in the future. Thank you.
Really appreciate you.